Imagine this, you're sitting across from someone you trust. The lighting is soft, maybe it's evening, and there's a pause in the conversation. Then, almost involuntarily, you begin to open up. You tell them about the project you're working on, how it's finally beginning to take shape. You speak of your dreams, your fears, that strange thing that happened last week that shook you up more than it should have. You pour it out, a flood of raw experience. And as you finish, expecting a cathartic release or at least understanding, there's silence. Or worse, casual indifference. Why does it feel like a betrayal? Why does it feel like something sacred has been diluted even when you chose to share it? Carl Jung once said, the most important problems in life are fundamentally insoluble. They can never be solved but only outgrown. We often misunderstand this. We don't outgrow problems by discussing them endlessly, dissecting them in public, or making them part of casual conversations. We outgrow them by carrying them inward, metabolizing them through silence, solitude, and struggle. But today, in a culture that confuses expression with progress and visibility with value, we hemorrhage our inner world into the external. And it costs us more than we realize. When we talk too soon, too often, or to the wrong people, something begins to die, not just privacy, but potency. Every thought you release loses a part of its force. Every dream you expose prematurely becomes vulnerable to interpretation, dismissal, and contamination. The energy that could have fueled its manifestation is spent defending, explaining, or simply surviving someone else's perception. The philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer once compared our inner life to a flame, something that must be protected from wind and cold. He warned against the dispersion of one's psychic energy through idle talk and excessive socializing. The more unintelligent a man is, he wrote, the less mysterious existence seems to him. And yet, we are encouraged to make our existence transparent, to flatten the mystery, to narrate our becoming as if it were a reality show. There is a psychological violence in this transparency. When you speak about something that is still forming, be it a new insight, an emotional wound, or a fragile hope, you risk interrupting its organic evolution. The psyche is not a broadcast station. It is a sacred space of alchemical transformation. But when we constantly externalize our inner material, we surrender that space to the judgments and projections of others. Their eyes become mirrors and we begin to shape ourselves according to reflections that do not belong to us. Friedrich Nietzsche, who knew deeply the tension between self-concealment and self-expression, warned, whatever is profound loves masks. Not out of deception but necessity. Masks protect. Masks delay interpretation. They allow for incubation. Oversharing is a kind of premature unveiling, a stripping away of symbolic masks that serve to gestate meaning over time. Why are we so compelled to speak? To narrate? To explain? To confess? Perhaps it is fear that if we do not speak, we will disappear. That silence is equivalent to erasure. But silence is not absence. It is a crucible. Jung called it the realm of the soul. In that silence, the unconscious is at work, rearranging, digesting, creating. To speak too soon is to interrupt the work. To narrate prematurely is to disrupt the unfolding story of the self. In a world obsessed with telling, the sacred act may now be withholding. And this is where it begins, the slow, quiet rebellion against compulsive self-disclosure. A turning inward, not out of fear, but reverence. Not secrecy, but sanctity. Now ask yourself, what parts of your life have you spoken of too soon? What dreams lost their wings when you exposed them to are not yet meant for flight? We speak often, not because we have something essential to say, but because the ego is starving. It wants acknowledgement, validation, applause. It wants to be seen, even if what it shows isn't real. In this way, modern culture has become a theater of the incomplete self. Half-formed thoughts are paraded as wisdom. Raw emotion is confused for depth. And the inner world, which should be a sacred temple, is turned into a stage. But what is this hunger, truly? Where does it originate? Carl Jung identified the ego as the conscious center of the psyche, necessary but inherently limited. It is not the self, but a fragile structure we build to survive. The ego fears what it cannot control. And silence, true inner silence, is beyond its dominion. To fall into silence is to risk dissolving the boundaries the ego worked so hard to build. That's why it talks. That's why it performs. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls, Jung wrote. And in today's digital landscape, the absurdity has reached new heights. We document our pain in pixels, not privacy. We expose our process in real time, seeking comfort in the gaze of strangers. But the soul is not nourished by exposure, it grows in the dark, like roots. In contrast, the soul has no need for validation. It is timeless, vast, and deep. When we silence the ego's clamor, something else begins to emerge, not louder, but deeper. A kind of quiet intelligence, a knowing that cannot be explained, only lived. But to access it, we must endure the withdrawal, the almost unbearable quiet that follows the refusal to overshare. This is where most turn back. The void is too empty, too silent. And so they speak again, narrate again, leak again. Aldous Huxley, in his exploration of consciousness, spoke of the doors of perception. But he also warned that most people prefer the doors to remain slightly ajar, enough to glimpse, not enough to be transformed. To be truly changed by silence requires courage. You must be willing to not be known, not be understood, not even be remembered. But what if that's where your real life begins? Viktor Frankl, survivor of the Holocaust and the mind behind man's search for meaning, once wrote, "When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves." Now consider, what if your compulsion to share is not something to indulge, but to confront? Not a personality trait, but a spiritual wound? When you tell everyone what's happening in your life, what you're building, feeling, fearing, you may think you're processing. But you're actually dispersing psychic energy. Energy that could have fueled resilience is now scattered in conversations that cannot hold it. Energy that could have built a future is now diluted by the present's compulsive narration. Silence, in contrast, is generative. It doesn't merely preserve, it gestates. When you withhold, you allow your inner world to ferment, to deepen, to ripen. There is wisdom in delay. There is power in the pause. To speak at the wrong time is to harvest too early, to kill the fruit before it's sweet. Jean-Paul Sartre, existentialist and fierce defender of human freedom, reminded us man is nothing else but what he makes of himself. And how we make ourselves is directly shaped by what we choose to reveal and when. To construct yourself publicly is to risk building a self that is performative, brittle, and reactive. But to build in silence is to root yourself in something deeper than applause, truth. So let the ego hunger. Let it twitch, protest, cry out. Do not feed it. Because in the stillness that follows starvation, you will find something the ego cannot mimic, an unshakable presence. A soul unshattered by exposure. There is a kind of magic that happens in the dark. Not the dark of ignorance, but the sacred shadow where ideas are still embryonic, where wounds are still bleeding but not yet scars, where the self is still becoming. It is in this darkness that transformation, the true kind, takes place. Not with an audience, not with applause, but in solitude and often in pain. Carl Jung understood this space intimately. He called it the Nigredo stage of alchemy, the blackening, the necessary decomposition of the old self. Before gold can be made, before enlightenment can dawn, something must dissolve. And that dissolution is quiet, hidden, unseen. In our age, secrecy has become suspect. To be private is to be suspicious. To withhold is to be dishonest. But this is a profound misunderstanding of what secrecy means. Secrecy is not about deceit. It's about reverence. The alchemist did not reveal the stages of transmutation not because he wished to hoard knowledge, but because he knew that disclosure without initiation destroys both the process and the student. In psychological terms, the same principle holds. To speak of what is not yet integrated is to risk losing it altogether. An insight spoken too soon can shatter under the weight of premature interpretation. A desire confessed too early can rot under the gaze of others' expectations. Your inner life is not raw material for others' curiosity. Arthur Schopenhauer warned of this with a cold clarity. To make public something that is personal and internal is to invite others to contaminate what is sacred with their mediocrity. Harsh, perhaps, but ask yourself, how many times have you felt polluted by another's careless comment? How many times has your truth bent itself into a shape more palatable, more acceptable, more marketable? There's a reason ancient mystery schools required silence. There's a reason rites of passage were performed in caves, forests, and deserts, not on stages. The most vital changes in your life require protection. They must be incubated, not shared. Even modern psychology affirms this. Neuroscience tells us that when we talk about our goals, particularly in a social setting, the brain gets a premature dopamine hit. You feel as if you've achieved something just by naming it. But the problem is, that feeling can reduce your drive to actually pursue the goal. You lose urgency. You mistake expression for execution. Nietzsche, whose philosophical hammer shattered many illusions, once said, "Invisible threads are the strongest ties." He was referring to those bonds and forces we cannot explain but are real nonetheless. Your inner development is one of those forces. The threads that connect your past to your potential, your pain to your purpose. Those must be woven in silence, or they fray. To share everything is to weaken those threads. This is not an indictment against all communication. There is a time to speak, to confess, to reveal. But most people speak as a form of escape, not integration. They talk to avoid feeling. They narrate to avoid becoming. But transformation requires discomfort, and it often requires solitude. You must be willing to carry your process alone, not forever, but long enough for it to become yours. Before it can be seen by others, it must be digested by you. That is the alchemy of secrecy. What you withhold not out of fear, but out of wisdom becomes power. So the next time you feel the impulse to speak, to share, to keep it real in public, ask yourself, is this truth fully mine yet? Or am I still forming it? Because whatever is still forming needs silence more than sound. What happens to a sacred truth when it's seen too soon by eyes that do not understand it? It twists. It bends under the pressure of other people's perceptions. It changes shape, not because the truth itself is weak, but because the human psyche is deeply impressionable. We think we're being honest when we tell others about our inner world, but often we're simply offering our soul up for distortion. And the most dangerous distortions are not the ones that mock or reject us, but the ones that subtly reshape us through praise, validation, or misunderstanding. There is a violence in being seen too early, especially by the wrong people. Jung warned us that the unconscious is not a tame territory. It holds archetypes, shadows, forgotten desires, ancestral grief. To bring anything from that depth into the light is already a delicate act. But when we expose it to others before we've wrestled with it ourselves, we risk having our experience reduced, categorized, or misinterpreted. And once we hear someone else's version of our story, it becomes difficult, sometimes impossible, to hear our own. This is the peril of the social gaze. Jean-Paul Sartre captured this danger in his concept of the look. The moment we become aware that someone else is watching us and we begin to see ourselves not through our own consciousness but through theirs, we become objectified, turned into a character in their world. Sartre famously wrote, "Hell is other people, not because others are evil, but because their gaze can trap us, freeze us, turn us into something other than ourselves." Think about the times you've shared something deeply personal, a dream, a new beginning, a spiritual experience, and watched as it was met with blank stares, polite nods, or unsolicited advice. Even if no malice was intended, something was lost in that moment. The thing you held sacred is now diluted, redefined, no longer pure in your own memory. This isn't about paranoia. It's about psychological boundaries. Friedrich Nietzsche again touched this with his typical fire. He who despises himself still respects himself as one who despises. But he who exposes his soul to unworthy eyes ceases to respect it at all. There's a slow erosion of self-respect that happens when we keep handing over our inner treasures to those who cannot or will not honor them. Each exposure chips away at the integrity of the soul. What then do? We practice sacred discernment. We learn to identify not just what to share, but when, how, and with whom. Not every friend is an altar. Not every moment is an invitation. Some things must remain unspoken, not because they're shameful, but because they're still alive, still moving, still sacred. There's a profound difference between solitude and isolation. Solitude is chosen. It is generative, healing, and fiercely alive. In solitude, you are not hiding from others, you are protecting something essential from disfigurement. Viktor Frankl wrote that meaning is not something we invent, it's something we discover. But discovery requires space. You do not find meaning in a conversation thread or a comment section. You find it in silence, in stillness, in the moments when no one is looking. That is where truth ferments, where identity consolidates, where the self returns to itself. So protect that space. Guard it. And if you feel lonely in the silence, remember, you are not alone. You are in the company of your becoming. And that is a more intimate companion than any external listener could ever be. Let the eyes of others remain outside your sacred process. Because some transformations must occur unseen. There is a rare and forgotten strength in restraint, not the kind that suppresses, but the kind that honors timing. In a world that rewards impulsivity, immediacy, and the constant stream of updates, to hold something inward is a radical act. It is not fear. It is art. To carry something pain, inspiration, change without rushing to label it, share it, or make sense of it aloud requires not just discipline but trust. Trust in yourself. Trust in the process. Trust that what grows inside you has its own rhythm, one that doesn't require the approval of others to be real. Carl Jung observed that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Making the darkness conscious is not a public act. It is slow, often disorienting, and deeply private. And yet, we constantly short-circuit this process by trying to define ourselves before we are ready, by verbalizing an insight still forming, by wrapping words around an emotion still raw. Why do we do this? Because it's easier to talk than to sit in the discomfort of not knowing. It's easier to share our questions than to bear them. But the soul doesn't rush. The psyche unfolds. And there is a beauty in this unfolding that cannot be accelerated without damage. Aldous Huxley warned against the tyranny of speed in the modern world. Speed, it seems to me, provides the one genuinely modern pleasure. And in that pleasure, we lose contact with the sacred. We mistake movement for meaning, disclosure for depth. But spiritual depth moves like water through soil, slow, steady, almost imperceptible. To hold something inward is to allow it to deepen before it breaks the surface. This is not asceticism. This is not emotional repression. This is cultivation. The poet Rilke once urged a young man, "You must live the questions now." To live the questions means not forcing an answer. It means allowing the ambiguity, the tension, to mature inside you. And that means not speaking it out into the world prematurely. Words are not containers for mystery, they are often attempts to resolve it. But not all mysteries should be resolved. Some are meant to shape you from the inside. When you stop telling what happens in your life, something miraculous happens, you begin to feel it more fully. You are no longer narrating your experience from the outside, you are inhabiting it. Without the pressure to make it understandable to others, you allow it to remain what it is, alive, fluid, transformative. You become your own witness. Arthur Schopenhauer spoke of genius as the capacity to look inward and stay there, even when the world offers distraction. And the world today offers nothing but distraction. Notifications, conversations, platforms, each a temptation to fracture your attention and scatter your becoming. But to hold inward is to gather your energy, to become a container for your own transformation. This is a form of integrity, not in the moral sense, but in the structural one. Integrity as in wholeness. The moment you externalize, you risk fragmentation. But when you hold inward, you become solid, rooted, prepared. And eventually, there will come a time to speak. A time to share not as performance, but as offering. Not for validation, but from fullness. When the inside is fully baked, when the healing is sealed, when the change is embodied, then your words will carry the weight of truth. Until then, be still. There is power in restraint. There is depth in delay. And there is sacredness in the quiet corners of your life that no one else gets to see. Eventually, if you walk far enough into silence, it stops being emptiness and becomes a force. Not a void, but a vessel. Not passive, but potent. A deep reservoir of meaning, presence, and clarity. And this is where the paradox completes itself, where you finally understand why you had to stop telling everyone what happens in your life. Because in holding back, you were not withholding. You were forging. When you no longer outsource your experience for interpretation or applause, you begin to experience life in its purest form. Unmediated. Undistorted. Yours. Carl Jung wrote of individuation, the lifelong process of becoming one's true self. This is not a process you can live out loud. It cannot survive the noise of constant narration. The self is not a brand. It is not a product. It is a mystery, a living system growing in directions you cannot predict and cannot explain. And so much of that growth must be hidden. Not because it's fragile, but because it's sacred. This sacredness, this power, grows in proportion to your ability to contain it. Every experience you hold inward becomes fuel. Not just for insight, but for embodiment. You stop being someone who talks about healing and start becoming healed. You stop projecting your becoming and start being. Words become unnecessary. Presence begins to speak. Viktor Frankl understood this kind of power. Having endured the most unspeakable suffering, he emerged not bitter, but fiercely alive, rooted in the belief that life is never made unbearable by circumstances, but only by lack of meaning and purpose. Silence, then, is not withdrawal from meaning, but the condition in which meaning can finally be heard. So what, practically, does this look like? It looks like resisting the urge to explain yourself when no explanation is needed. It looks like allowing your grief to live in your body without asking someone else to carry it. It looks like tending to your ideas, your visions, your transformations in solitude until they're ripe enough to bear the weight of other people's understanding or misunderstanding. It means protecting your fire. Because make no mistake, every time you expose your inner flame to the wrong wind, you risk extinguishing it. Not immediately. Sometimes the flame goes out slowly, subtly. You stop feeling the urgency. You lose the clarity. You begin doubting what once felt certain. And before you know it, the energy is gone, dissipated into 1,000 moments of misplaced speech. But when you protect the flame, something incredible happens. You become magnetic, not because you were loud, but because you were luminous. Not because you perform, but because you emanate. Others feel the depth without needing it explained. They sense the coherence in you, the weight of someone who has not squandered their inner life on the marketplace of attention. Friedrich Nietzsche called this the Übermensch, not a superior being, but a fully integrated one. A person who no longer needs to be seen to feel real. A person who creates values, who carries their own meaning. This kind of being is only possible when one has learned the discipline of silence. Not silence as in muteness, but silence as in alignment. There will come a moment in your life, perhaps soon, when you'll realize the most powerful thing you can do is not speak. Not because you're hiding. Not because you're ashamed. But because you know that what lives in you is still becoming. Still ripening. Still sacred. That moment is not weakness. That is mastery. So pause. Be still. Let them wonder. And in that stillness, feel the quiet roar of everything you've become. Not because they heard it, but because you did.